Thomas Donovan had spent 3 days at the homeless shelter, helping others find warmth and dignity in a cold world. And now he stood in the gleaming entrance of the Sterling Rose, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, wearing his weathered coat and scuffed boots. The manager took one look at him and made his judgment immediately, his voice dripping with contempt as he demanded Thomas leave before he called the police, insisting that people like him had no place among the crystal chandeliers and wealthy patrons. The other diners watched with a mixture of pity and disgust as the homeless man was publicly humiliated, accused of trying to scam a free meal, threatened with arrest. But when the restaurant doors opened and a man in an immaculate suit strode across the marble floor, everything changed in an instant. Michael Donovan, CEO of a billion-dollar company, reached the homeless man and wrapped him in an embrace, his voice carrying across the silent dining room with 2 words that made the manager's face drain of all color. He called him Dad. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Thomas Donovan pushed open the heavy glass door of the Sterling Rose and immediately felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward him. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of the Excelsior Tower in the heart of downtown, and it was exactly as exclusive as its reputation suggested. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light dancing across white marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Each table was draped in pristine white linen, set with gleaming silverware and delicate china that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. The air smelled of expensive wine, fresh flowers, and wealth. Thomas stood just inside the entrance, his worn work boots leaving faint prints on the spotless floor. His coat, once a deep brown, had faded to a mottled tan, its edges frayed and one pocket hanging by a few stubborn threads. Beneath it he wore a plaid flannel shirt that had seen better days, the colors washed out from countless cleanings, and a pair of jeans with permanent stains at the knees. His weathered hands bore the calluses and scars of a lifetime of honest work, and his face, lined and weary, showed every one of his 63 years. His gray hair stuck out at odd angles beneath a knit cap, and his beard, though clean, was uneven and unkempt. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had just spent 72 hours at St. Margaret's homeless shelter, serving meals, organizing donations, and offering whatever comfort he could to those who had nowhere else to turn. The contrast between Thomas and his surroundings could not have been more stark. At the nearest table, a woman in a black cocktail dress and pearls paused with her wine glass halfway to her lips, staring. 2 tables over, a man in a gray suit leaned toward his companion and whispered something behind his hand. The bartender, polishing a crystal tumbler, froze mid-motion. Even the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers seemed to falter. Thomas had expected this reaction, but it still made his chest tighten with discomfort. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and approached the hostess stand with as much dignity as he could muster. His son had made a reservation, and Thomas was determined to keep this dinner appointment, no matter how out of place he looked. Jennifer Martinez stood behind the hostess stand, her perfectly manicured hand frozen above the reservation book. She was 26 years old and had worked at the Sterling Rose for 3 years, long enough to recognize the clientele at a glance, to know which guests preferred the corner tables and which insisted on being seated near the windows overlooking the city. She had seen celebrities, politicians, and business moguls walk through those doors, but she had never seen anyone who looked like the man now standing before her. Her smile, professional and practiced, faltered. She glanced past Thomas toward the bar, catching the eye of Marcus, one of the senior servers, who had stopped mid-stride with a tray of cocktails balanced on one hand. His eyebrows rose in a silent question. At table 7, another server named Christine leaned close to her partner David and whispered something that made him turn and stare. The whispers spread like ripples across water, quiet but unmistakable, and Jennifer felt her face grow warm with a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. She had no idea what to do. The restaurant had standards, expectations, a certain atmosphere to maintain, but the man in front of her was smiling gently, waiting patiently, his weathered face kind despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. Thomas cleared his throat softly and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle, surprisingly educated. He explained that he had a reservation, that he was meeting his son for dinner, that the name would be under Donovan. Jennifer blinked, her fingers moving automatically to the leather-bound reservation book. She found the name immediately because it was marked with a small gold star, the symbol they used for VIP guests, for the people whose business kept the Sterling Rose operating. Donovan, party of 2, 7 o'clock, requested the private corner table by the fountain. But looking at this man, with his tattered coat and scuffed boots, with the faint smell of industrial soap and something else she could not quite identify, Jennifer could not reconcile what she was seeing with what was written in the book. Her mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps he had the wrong restaurant. Perhaps he was confused. Perhaps this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask for clarification. But the words caught in her throat. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching, crisp and purposeful, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Manager Richard Blackwell was coming to handle this situation, and Jennifer had never been more grateful to pass a problem to someone else. Richard Blackwell had been the general manager of the Sterling Rose for 8 years, and he took immense pride in maintaining the restaurant's reputation as one of the finest dining establishments in the city. He was 42 years old, impeccably groomed, with dark hair swept back with just enough product to look effortless. His navy suit was tailored to perfection, cut from Italian wool that cost more than some people paid in rent, and his crisp white shirt was monogrammed with his initials on the cuff. A Swiss watch gleamed on his left wrist, the kind of timepiece that signaled success and status to those who knew what to look for. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his signature burgundy tie was knotted with mathematical precision. Richard carried himself with the absolute certainty of someone who knew he belonged exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. He had been in his office reviewing the wine inventory when Christine had knocked urgently and whispered that there was a situation at the front. Now, as he approached the hostess stand and saw the homeless man standing there in his tattered clothes, Richard felt a surge of irritation mixed with something deeper, something closer to revulsion. This was precisely the kind of problem he had trained his staff to prevent. The Sterling Rose had a certain standard, a certain image, and this man threatened both simply by standing there. Richard positioned himself between Thomas and the dining room, his body language making it clear who held the authority in this situation. He looked Thomas up and down slowly, deliberately, his lip curling almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and professional on the surface, but underneath it carried an unmistakable edge of condescension. He asked if he could help with something, the emphasis on the word help, making it clear he doubted there was anything this man could possibly need from the Sterling Rose. Thomas repeated what he had told Jennifer, explaining calmly that he had a reservation under the name Donovan, that he was meeting his son. Richard's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Jennifer, who nodded nervously and pointed to the entry in the reservation book. Richard looked at the gold star, at the notation for the private corner table, and then back at Thomas. His expression hardened. He asked Thomas directly if he understood what kind of establishment this was, whether he realized this was not the sort of place that served walk-ins or casual diners. His tone suggested he was speaking to someone who might not fully comprehend the situation, someone who needed things explained in simple terms. Richard leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone, the kind someone might use when explaining something complicated to a child. He asked Thomas if perhaps he had gotten confused, if maybe he had been given incorrect information, if he understood that the Sterling Rose required reservations weeks in advance, and that walk-ins were simply not accommodated. Thomas met his gaze steadily and repeated, with infinite patience, that he was not a walk-in, that his son Michael had made the reservation, and that the name was Donovan and it should be in the system for 7 o'clock. Richard's jaw tightened. He turned to Jennifer and asked her to pull up the reservation details on the computer system, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wood of the hostess stand. Jennifer's fingers flew across the keyboard, and within seconds the information appeared on the screen. Richard leaned in to read it, and Thomas watched as the manager's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession. The reservation was indeed there, marked as VIP status, with a note that read, "Preferred guest, Donovan Industries, CEO dining, best table, champagne service." The account had a credit card on file, a corporate card with a spending limit that made Richard's eyes widen slightly. But then his expression hardened again, suspicion replacing surprise. He straightened and looked at Thomas with barely concealed contempt. He asked point blank if Thomas was claiming to be associated with Donovan Industries, his tone making it abundantly clear that he found this laughable. Thomas explained quietly that he was not claiming anything, that he was simply meeting his son for dinner as they had arranged. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. He asked what Thomas did for a living, where he had come from, why he was dressed like someone who had been sleeping on the streets. The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to expose what Richard clearly believed was a deception or delusion. Thomas felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over him. But he refused to let it break his composure. He explained that he had been volunteering at a homeless shelter for the past 3 days, that he had come directly from there to meet his son, that he had not had time to go home and change. Richard's expression made it clear he did not believe a single word. He asked why someone connected to a CEO would be volunteering at a homeless shelter, why he would show up to an exclusive restaurant looking like this, and what he was really doing here. Richard's voice rose, no longer making any attempt to keep the conversation private. He declared that he ran a respectable establishment, that the Sterling Rose catered to a certain clientele, and that he could not simply allow anyone who wandered in off the street to claim a reservation. His words carried across the dining room, cutting through the soft jazz and the gentle clink of silverware against china. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The woman in the black cocktail dress and pearls stared openly now, her wine glass forgotten on the table. At table 12, an elderly couple leaned toward each other, their faces etched with concern and something that looked like pity. Near the windows, a group of businessmen in expensive suits exchanged glances, one of them shaking his head slowly. A younger woman at the bar whispered to her companion, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide. The entire restaurant had become an audience to Thomas's humiliation, and Richard seemed to feed off their attention, his posture straightening, his voice growing more authoritative. He asked Thomas again, louder this time, to explain exactly who he thought he was, to prove his connection to this reservation, to show some form of identification or confirmation. Thomas stood very still, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, his shoulders squared despite the shame burning in his chest. He could feel every eye on him, could sense the judgment radiating from the well-dressed patrons who saw only his tattered coat and scuffed boots, who had already decided what kind of person he must be. Some faces showed pity, which was almost worse than the contempt, because pity meant they saw him as helpless, as something less than whole. Others showed naked disgust, as if his very presence was an affront to their evening, a stain on their expensive experience. One man actually pulled his chair slightly away, as if poverty might be contagious. Thomas took a slow, deep breath, centering himself the way he had learned to do during his years of service work. During the countless times he had faced difficulty with grace, he spoke quietly, with dignity, explaining once more that his son had made the reservation, that he was simply here for dinner, that there was no deception or confusion. But his quiet words were drowned out by Richard's increasingly aggressive tone, by the manager's insistence that this situation needed to be resolved immediately, before it disrupted the other guests any further. Richard's patience, which had been thin from the start, finally snapped completely. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and held it up for Thomas to see, declaring that he was going to call the police if Thomas did not leave the premises immediately. He accused Thomas of attempting to scam his way into a free meal, of exploiting someone else's reservation, of trying to take advantage of the restaurant's hospitality. His voice dripped with accusation and certainty, the absolute conviction of someone who believed he had seen through a con. He said he had dealt with people like Thomas before, people who thought they could talk their way into places they did not belong, people who preyed on the generosity and confusion of legitimate businesses. Thomas felt the words like physical blows, each accusation adding another layer of humiliation. He tried to speak, to explain once more, but Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture. The manager turned to Jennifer and told her to call Stanley, their security guard, his tone making it clear this was no longer a request but a command. Jennifer hesitated for just a moment, her face conflicted, but then she picked up the phone at the hostess stand and made the call, her voice barely above a whisper. Within 30 seconds, Stanley appeared from the side corridor where he had been monitoring the parking area. He was a large man, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that usually deterred any problems before they started. He wore a black suit and an earpiece, looking every bit the professional security officer. Stanley approached the hostess stand with measured steps, his eyes assessing the situation quickly. Richard immediately launched into an explanation, gesturing at Thomas as he spoke. He said they had a vagrant claiming to have a reservation, refusing to leave when asked, causing a disturbance that was upsetting the other guests. He instructed Stanley to escort Thomas out of the building and to call the police if he resisted in any way. Stanley looked at Thomas, taking in the weathered coat and tired eyes, and his expression was neutral but not unkind. He asked Thomas quietly if he would come with him, please, to avoid any further scene. Thomas felt something break inside him, not his dignity but his hope that this situation could be resolved peacefully, that someone would simply believe him or at least give him the benefit of the doubt until his son arrived. Emma Peterson had been working at the Sterling Rose for only 8 months, her first real job after finishing culinary school, and she still felt like an outsider among the veteran staff who moved through the dining room with practiced ease. She was 23 years old, earnest and idealistic, and she had taken this job because she believed that food could bring people together, that hospitality meant treating every person with kindness and respect. Now, standing near table 9 with a water pitcher in her hand, she watched the scene unfolding at the hostess stand with growing discomfort. Something about it felt deeply wrong. The homeless man was not being aggressive or demanding. He was standing there quietly, speaking in measured tones, maintaining his composure even as the manager berated him in front of everyone. Emma had seen Richard handle difficult situations before, had watched him smoothly deflect demanding customers and resolve complaints with practiced diplomacy. But this was different. This felt cruel. She set down her pitcher and walked toward the hostess stand before she could talk herself out of it, her heart pounding. She approached Thomas and offered him a glass of water, her voice gentle, asking if he would like to sit down for a moment while things were sorted out. Thomas looked at her with such gratitude that it made her chest ache, and he accepted the water with a quiet thank you, his weathered hands wrapping around the glass carefully. Richard's head snapped toward Emma, his expression thunderous. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing, his voice sharp enough to cut. He told her that she was not helping the situation, that she was encouraging this man to stay when he needed to leave, that she was directly contradicting his authority in front of the entire restaurant. Emma felt her face flush hot with embarrassment and something else, something closer to anger. She tried to explain that she was just offering basic hospitality, that surely it would not hurt to let the man have some water. But Richard cut her off. He told her to return to her section immediately and to focus on the actual paying customers who deserved her attention. His words stung, the implication clear that Thomas was not worthy of consideration or basic human decency. Emma retreated, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her pitcher, but she did not return to her tables. Instead, she positioned herself near the wait station where she could still see what was happening, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Thomas set the water glass down on the edge of the hostess stand and closed his eyes for just a moment, taking a deep, steadying breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. When he opened his eyes again, they were calm but filled with a quiet sadness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with disappointment in how the world sometimes worked. He spoke directly to Richard, his voice low and measured, explaining that he did not want any trouble, that he understood how this must look, that he simply wanted to have dinner with his son, who he had not seen in 3 weeks. He said that Michael would be here any minute, that if Richard would just allow him to wait quietly, everything would be cleared up and there would be no further disruption. Richard let out a bark of laughter that held no warmth whatsoever. He asked Thomas if he really expected anyone to believe that story, if he truly thought anyone would accept that a man who looked like he had been living on the streets could possibly have a son who dined at the Sterling Rose. He gestured at Thomas's appearance, at the tattered coat and worn boots, at the stains on his jeans and the uneven beard, as if these things were evidence of some fundamental unworthiness. Richard said that men who ate at this restaurant arrived in luxury cars, wore designer suits, conducted business deals worth millions of dollars. He asked what kind of son would allow his father to walk around looking like this. Suggested that if Thomas truly had a son, the son had clearly abandoned him. And perhaps with good reason. The words hung in the air, vicious and cutting, and several of the nearby diners gasped audibly. Even Stanley, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably, his expression troubled, but Richard was not finished. He said that people like Thomas always had stories, always had excuses, always claimed connections to important people or circumstances that would explain away their situation. He declared that he had heard it all before, and he was not going to fall for it now. The tension in the restaurant had reached a breaking point, the air thick with anticipation and discomfort. Thomas stood very still, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides, and for the first time his composure seemed ready to crack. The heavy glass doors of the Sterling Rose swung open, and Michael Donovan stepped into the restaurant at precisely 7 o'clock, exactly as he had planned. He was 38 years old, tall and lean, with his father's strong jawline softened by his mother's gentler features. His charcoal suit was immaculate, cut by a tailor on Fifth Avenue who knew his measurements by heart, and his white shirt was crisp enough to suggest it had been pressed that very afternoon. His shoes were Italian leather, polished but not ostentatious, and his watch was expensive but understated, the kind that signaled success to those who knew what to look for without screaming for attention. His dark hair was swept back neatly, touched with just enough gray at the temples to lend him gravitas, and his clean-shaven face bore the confident expression of someone who had spent the day making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Michael carried himself with the quiet assurance that came from years of leadership, from building his father's small manufacturing business into an industrial empire that now employed over 5,000 people across 3 states. He had been in back-to-back meetings since 6 that morning, negotiating a merger that would expand Donovan Industries into new markets, but he had blocked out this evening months ago because dinner with his father was sacred, non-negotiable, no matter what else demanded his attention. As he stepped into the dining room, Michael's eyes swept across the space with practiced efficiency, looking for his father at their usual corner table by the fountain. Instead, he saw a crowd gathered near the hostess stand. A knot of people that seemed out of place in the normally serene atmosphere. His brow furrowed slightly. He noticed the security guard. Noticed the manager whose back was to him. Noticed the way the other diners were all turned toward whatever was happening at the entrance. And then, through a gap in the crowd, Michael saw him. His father, standing there in his worn coat and scuffed boots, holding himself with dignity despite being surrounded by staff, despite the obvious tension radiating from every person nearby. Michael's expression shifted instantly from mild curiosity to sharp concern, his entire body tensing as he began to understand that something was very wrong. Michael's stride faltered for just a fraction of a second as recognition and comprehension crashed over him simultaneously. That was his father standing at the hostess stand, and he was clearly not being welcomed. Michael's eyes took in every detail in an instant. The way his father's shoulders were set with forced dignity, the way the manager was positioned aggressively close to him, the security guard hovering nearby, the water glass clutched in his father's weathered hands. Michael's expression transformed from confusion to something much darker. A cold fury that settled over his features like a mask. He began moving across the restaurant with purpose, his leather shoes striking the marble floor with sharp, deliberate clicks that cut through the tension like gunshots. Conversations died as he passed. The businessmen at the window table fell silent. The elderly couple turned to watch. The woman in pearls set down her wine glass with a soft clink. Michael's presence commanded attention in a way that was entirely different from the scene at the hostess stand. his quiet authority filling the space without any need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. He moved like someone who was used to rooms rearranging themselves around him, who expected obstacles to simply dissolve before he reached them. Jennifer saw him first, and her eyes went wide with recognition. She had checked him in dozens of times, knew his name, knew his generous tipping habits, knew that he was one of their most valued regular guests. She opened her mouth to greet him, but no sound came out. Marcus, the server, still frozen with his tray of cocktails, straightened instinctively as Michael passed. Emma watched from her position by the wait station, her heart beginning to pound with hope and apprehension. Michael did not acknowledge any of them. His eyes were locked on his father, on the man who had taught him everything that mattered, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who had given him the seed money to start his first business with savings accumulated over 30 years of careful sacrifice. His father, who now stood surrounded by staff like a criminal, whose face showed the kind of hurt that came not from physical pain but from being treated as less than human. Michael closed the distance in seconds, his jaw set, his hands clenched at his sides, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Michael reached his father and, without hesitation, without any regard for the expensive suit or the pristine setting or the dozens of eyes watching, he pulled Thomas into a tight embrace, his arms wrapped around the tattered coat, his hands pressed against his father's back, and he held on for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. When he finally pulled back, Michael kept one hand on his father's shoulder, and his voice rang out across the silent dining room, clear and unmistakable and filled with warmth. He said, "Dad, it is so good to see you. I am sorry I am late." The single word, that simple syllable, detonated like a bomb in the hushed restaurant. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that the soft jazz playing through the speakers seemed suddenly deafening. Every fork, every knife, every wineglass was frozen in mid-air. The elderly couple stared with their mouths slightly open. The businessmen leaned back in their chairs as if physically pushed. The woman in pearls brought her hand to her chest. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, a mixture of relief and vindication flooding through her. Jennifer made a small sound in her throat, something between a gasp and a whimper. Marcus finally set down his tray before he dropped it. And Richard Blackwell, who had been mid-sentence in yet another dismissive comment to Stanley, fell silent as if someone had cut his vocal cords. The color drained from his face in a visible wave, starting at his forehead and washing down to his neck, leaving him pale and waxy. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his carefully cultivated professional composure shattering like crystal dropped on marble. His eyes, which moments before had been hard with certainty and contempt, now showed pure, undiluted horror as he realized exactly what he had done, exactly who he had humiliated, exactly how catastrophically he had misjudged this situation. Michael turned slowly to face Richard, his arm still around his father's shoulders, and his expression was colder than anything Richard had ever seen. The restaurant remained frozen, every person a statue, every breath held, waiting to see what would happen next in this drama that had transformed from humiliation to vindication in the space of a single embrace and 2 syllables. Richard's mind raced through the implications with the speed of a man watching his career collapse in real time. This was Thomas Donovan, father of Michael Donovan, CEO of Donovan Industries, the company that had held their annual board dinners at the Sterling Rose for the past 4 years, the account that brought in over $200,000 annually. This was the man he had just accused of scamming, had threatened with police, had publicly humiliated in front of a dining room full of witnesses. Richard's hands began to tremble. He tried to speak, but his throat had gone completely dry. Finally, words tumbled out in a stammering rush of apologies. He said he was terribly sorry, that there had been a misunderstanding, that he had not realized, that if he had only known. His voice climbed higher with each phrase, desperation bleeding through his professional veneer. Michael held up one hand, silencing Richard mid-sentence. His voice was calm but carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. He asked his father what had happened, turning away from Richard entirely as if the manager had ceased to exist as anything worth acknowledging. Thomas began to explain quietly. describing how he had been questioned, accused, threatened with arrest, told he did not belong. As Thomas spoke, the staff members who had been clustered around the hostess stand began to drift backward, creating distance between themselves and Richard. Jennifer took 3 steps to the left, her eyes fixed on the reservation book as if it required her complete attention. Marcus moved toward his section, suddenly very interested in checking on his tables. Christine and David retreated to the kitchen doors. Even Stanley, the security guard, shifted his weight, positioning himself slightly apart from the scene. They all understood what was happening, that Richard had made a catastrophic error in judgment, and they wanted no part of the fallout. Only Emma remained close, her young face showing relief and sadness in equal measure. Richard stood alone now, his Italian suit and Swiss watch and perfect tie suddenly seeming like costumes, like the trappings of authority that had been stripped away to reveal something small and petty underneath. He tried again to apologize, his voice breaking, but Michael still did not look at him. Michael listened to his father's quiet recitation of events, and with each detail his expression grew harder, more controlled, like steel being tempered in a forge. His voice remained level, almost conversational, but every person in the restaurant could hear the fury underneath, coiled and deadly, and all the more frightening for being restrained. He asked his father specific questions, his tone precise. Had Richard threatened to call the police? Thomas nodded. Had Richard accused him of trying to scam a free meal? Another nod. Had Richard done all of this publicly, in front of the other guests, loud enough for everyone to hear? Thomas glanced around at the watching diners and confirmed that yes, everyone had heard. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the rage building inside him. He turned his attention to the other patrons, addressing them directly now, his voice carrying across the dining room with the kind of authority that came from years of boardroom presentations and shareholder meetings. He apologized for the disruption to their evening, explained that his father had spent the past 3 days volunteering at St. Margaret's homeless shelter, helping to serve meals and organize donations for people who had nowhere else to turn. He said his father had come directly from there to meet him for dinner, that Thomas had not wanted to cancel their plans or waste time going home to change, because family time was precious and fleeting. His words painted a picture that was the exact opposite of everything Richard had assumed, transforming Thomas from a vagrant trying to con his way into a free meal into a selfless man who had sacrificed his own comfort to help others. Several of the diners looked ashamed now, their earlier judgment turning inward. Michael continued, his voice still level but carrying an unmistakable weight. He asked the room if anyone believed it was acceptable to judge another human being based solely on their appearance, to assume the worst without asking questions, and to humiliate someone publicly without giving them the dignity of being heard. The silence that followed was damning. Michael finally turned back to Richard, and when he spoke, his voice dropped lower, became more intimate, and therefore more devastating. He asked Richard directly how he would feel if his own father had been treated this way. Thomas spoke up then, his voice quiet but steady, explaining to Michael and to anyone else who was listening that he had been at St. Margaret's for 72 hours straight because they had been short-staffed during the cold snap. He described how the shelter had been overwhelmed with people seeking warmth, how he had helped prepare and serve over 300 meals, how he had sorted through donation boxes and organized clothing distributions, how he had sat with frightened families and listened to their stories until the early hours of the morning. He said he had showered at the shelter before leaving, had put on the cleanest clothes he had there, but that after 3 days of constant work, there was only so much he could do about his appearance. He had not wanted to miss dinner with Michael, had not wanted to push back their plans again, because they had already rescheduled twice due to Michael's business travel. Michael's expression softened as his father spoke, the anger giving way to something closer to pride mixed with exasperation. He explained to the room, though his words were clearly directed at Richard, that his father had been volunteering at homeless shelters for over 20 years, ever since Michael's mother had passed away from cancer. He said Thomas had spent his entire career as a machinist, had retired with a modest pension, and had immediately dedicated himself to serving others who had less than he did. Michael described how his father refused to accept money from him beyond what was needed for basic expenses, how Thomas insisted on living simply so he could donate most of his pension to the shelter, how he spent more nights sleeping on a cot in the volunteer room than in his own small apartment because he believed his presence made a difference. Michael's voice carried a mixture of frustration and deep respect as he explained that he had been trying for years to convince his father to accept help, to live more comfortably, to let someone else carry the burden of service for a while. But Thomas was stubborn, had always been stubborn, believed that a life of comfort and ease was worth nothing if it came at the cost of turning away from those in need. Michael finally turned his full attention to Richard, and the manager visibly flinched under that cold, measured gaze. Michael asked Richard a simple question, his voice devoid of inflection. He asked if Richard understood that his actions had consequences, if he grasped that the way he treated people reflected not just on himself, but on the entire establishment he claimed to manage. Richard began speaking immediately, words tumbling out in a desperate cascade. He said he was protecting the restaurant, maintaining standards, ensuring the comfort of the other guests. He insisted that the Sterling Rose had policies about dress codes and appropriate attire, that these policies existed for good reasons, that he was simply doing his job as he had been trained to do. He said he could not have known who Thomas was, that anyone in his position would have made the same judgment call, that he was trying to preserve the restaurant's reputation and atmosphere. His voice grew more frantic as he spoke, pleading now, saying he had worked at the Sterling Rose for 8 years, that he had dedicated himself to excellence, that this was one mistake born from genuine concern for the business. He begged Michael to understand that he had been trying to do the right thing, that his intentions had been good even if the outcome was unfortunate. Michael let him finish, waiting until Richard's desperate explanations finally ran out of steam. Then he spoke, and his words cut through every excuse Richard had offered. He said there was a difference between policy and human decency, between maintaining standards and treating another person with cruelty. He pointed out that Richard had not simply asked Thomas to leave, had not quietly explained the dress code and offered to reschedule. Instead, Richard had publicly humiliated him, had raised his voice to ensure everyone could hear, had accused him of criminal intent without asking a single genuine question about his circumstances. Michael said that policies were meant to serve people, not the other way around, and that any manager worth his position should have the wisdom to understand when humanity mattered more than rules. He asked Richard what kind of establishment he thought he was protecting, what kind of excellence he thought he was preserving, when basic kindness was abandoned in favor of judgment based on appearances. The kitchen doors swung open and Gerald Morrison emerged, moving faster than a man of 65 typically moved. His face flushed and his breathing slightly labored as if he had rushed from somewhere far away. Gerald owned the Sterling Rose along with 2 other upscale establishments in the city, and he had built his reputation over 30 years on the principle that hospitality meant treating every guest with respect and dignity. He had been at home reviewing financial reports when Christine had called his personal cell phone, her voice urgent and frightened as she explained what was happening. Gerald had dropped everything, called his driver, and made the 20-minute journey in 12 minutes, his stomach twisting with dread the entire way. Now, seeing Michael Donovan standing with his arm around a man in tattered clothes, seeing Richard pale and stammering, seeing the entire dining room frozen in uncomfortable silence, Gerald felt his worst fears confirmed. He approached immediately, his hands outstretched in a gesture of apology and supplication. He addressed Thomas first, introducing himself and expressing his profound mortification at what had occurred. He said there were no words adequate to express how deeply sorry he was that this treatment violated everything the Sterling Rose was supposed to represent, that Thomas should never have been subjected to such humiliation in any establishment, but especially not in one that bore Gerald's name. He turned to Michael next, his distress evident in every line of his face, and apologized for the disruption, for the disgrace, for the failure of his staff to uphold the values he had tried to instill. Gerald's voice shook slightly as he explained that Donovan Industries had been one of their most valued partners for years, that the company's board dinners, executive lunches, and client entertainment events represented not just significant revenue, but a relationship he had always treasured. He said Michael's trust in the Sterling Rose had meant everything to him. that he had always believed their establishments provided not just excellent food, but an environment of warmth and welcome. Now, standing in the wreckage of that belief, Gerald looked like a man watching something precious shatter beyond repair. Gerald turned to Richard, and his voice, which had been apologetic and distressed moments before, became hard as iron. He said that Richard was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into this incident and his management practices in general. He told Richard to collect his personal belongings from his office and leave the premises within 15 minutes, that human resources would be in contact regarding the review process, that his access to restaurant systems was being revoked as they spoke. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Gerald cut him off with a sharp gesture, saying that nothing Richard could say would change what had happened here tonight, that actions had consequences and that those consequences began now. Richard's face crumpled, the full weight of his ruined career settling over him, and he turned and walked toward his office with shoulders slumped and head bowed, looking 20 years older than he had 30 minutes ago. Gerald then turned his attention to Thomas and Michael, insisting personally that he would escort them to their table, the very best table in the house, and the private corner booth by the fountain that Richard had seen in the reservation notes but had refused to honor. He guided them across the dining room himself, his manner solicitous and genuinely warm, and the other diners watched in silence as the homeless man and the CEO were seated with the kind of attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Gerald promised them that dinner would be entirely on the house, that their server would be his most experienced professional, that anything they wanted would be provided without question or hesitation. Before leaving them, Gerald called Emma over, and in front of the assembled staff and remaining diners, he commended her publicly for showing kindness when others had failed, for remembering that hospitality meant serving all people with dignity. Emma's eyes filled with tears as Gerald shook her hand and told her she embodied the true spirit of the Sterling Rose. As the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the other staff members moved through their duties with subdued expressions, each of them privately reckoning with their own role in what had transpired. Jennifer kept her eyes down, remembering how quickly she had wanted to pass the problem to someone else. Marcus thought about the whispers he had participated in, the assumptions he had made. Christine and David recalled how they had stepped back, how they had distanced themselves from Richard only after it was safe to do so, but had done nothing to stop the humiliation while it was happening. 6 weeks had passed since that terrible night at the Sterling Rose, and Richard Blackwell stood in the industrial kitchen of St. Margaret's homeless shelter, his hands wrapped in disposable gloves, ladling beef stew into bowls that would feed people who had not eaten in days. He wore jeans and a plain sweatshirt, both of which had acquired permanent stains over the past month and a half, and his once perfectly styled hair was now simply combed back with no product, showing more gray than he remembered having. The suspension from the Sterling Rose had become a termination after the investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents, smaller in scale but consistent in their judgment of people based on appearance and perceived status. Richard had lost his job, his reputation in the restaurant industry, and very nearly his sense of self. In the dark weeks that followed, his wife had suggested, with surprising gentleness, that perhaps this was an opportunity to learn something, to understand what he had done, and why it had been so wrong. She had found the volunteer information for St. Margaret's and had encouraged him, not forced him, to consider spending some time there. Richard had resisted at first, his pride still too wounded, but eventually desperation and genuine remorse had driven him to fill out the application. He had expected Thomas Donovan to refuse him, to turn him away with the same contempt Richard had shown, but instead Thomas had welcomed him quietly, shown him where to store his belongings, and put him to work washing dishes. That had been 5 weeks ago. Since then, Richard had served thousands of meals, had mopped floors and sorted donations, had listened to stories from people whose lives had taken turns he could never have imagined. He had met a former lawyer who had lost everything to medical bills, a teacher whose mental illness had cost her job and home, a veteran who could not adjust to civilian life, a teenager aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. Each person had shattered another piece of Richard's certainty about who deserved dignity and who did not. Thomas worked alongside him most days, never mentioning that night, never throwing it in Richard's face, simply modeling through his actions what it meant to serve without judgment. Gerald Morrison had not wasted the 6 weeks since the incident. The very next morning, after that terrible night, he had called an emergency meeting with the management teams from all 3 of his restaurants, and he had told them exactly what had happened at the Sterling Rose, sparing no detail, especially not the details that reflected poorly on his own oversight and training failures. He announced that every employee, from dishwashers to senior managers, would be required to complete a new comprehensive training program focused on dignity, respect, and the fundamental principles of genuine hospitality. Gerald hired a consulting firm that specialized in equity and inclusion to develop the curriculum, but he also insisted that the training include real stories, real consequences, real understanding of how judgment and prejudice could destroy not just a business relationship, but a human being's sense of worth. The new policies were clear and unambiguous. No guest would ever be turned away based on appearance alone. If there were concerns about dress code, they would be addressed privately and respectfully, with an offer of assistance rather than accusations. Every staff member was empowered to show kindness first and ask questions second, to treat uncertainty with grace rather than suspicion. Gerald also established a feedback system where employees could report concerns about management behavior without fear of retaliation, recognizing that Richard's actions had not happened in a vacuum, but had been enabled by a culture that prioritized appearances over people. 4 weeks into the implementation of the new program, Gerald received a call from Thomas Donovan, who explained that Richard had been volunteering at the shelter, that his transformation seemed genuine, and that perhaps Richard's story could serve a purpose beyond his own redemption. Gerald had been skeptical at first, the wound still too fresh, but he trusted Thomas's judgment and agreed to meet with Richard. The meeting had been difficult, with Richard barely able to look Gerald in the eye as he described his work at the shelter and what he had learned. But there was something different about him, something humbled and broken open in a way that seemed real. Gerald offered Richard a role in the training program, not as a manager but as a cautionary tale, someone who could stand before the staff and explain exactly how he had failed and why it mattered. Thomas and Michael continued their monthly dinners at the Sterling Rose, though now they were often joined by Emma, who had been promoted to assistant manager and who had become something of a family friend to the Donovans. Thomas still volunteered at St. Margaret's 3 or 4 days a week, still wore his simple clothes and scuffed boots, still chose service over comfort, because that was who he had always been and who he would always be. Michael had long since stopped trying to change his father, recognizing that Thomas's choices were not born from stubbornness, but from a deep understanding that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with how you treated the people around you. Richard continued his work at the shelter and with the training program, standing before new employees at the Sterling Rose and other restaurants in Gerald's group, telling his story without excuses or justifications. He described the moment when Michael had called Thomas Dad, described the sick feeling of watching his certainty crumble, described the long road of learning to see people as they truly were, rather than as he assumed them to be. Some audiences were skeptical of his transformation, suspicious of his motives. But Richard had learned to accept that skepticism as the natural consequence of his actions. What mattered was not whether people believed he had changed, but whether he actually had changed, whether he continued to do the work of examining his prejudices and choosing differently. The ripples from that one terrible night spread farther than anyone could have anticipated. Other restaurants in the city began implementing similar training programs. Local news covered the story, and social media amplified the message about judgment and dignity. Thousands of people shared their own experiences of being dismissed or humiliated based on appearance, and thousands more examined their own assumptions and biases. The lesson was simple but profound. You cannot know the measure of a person by looking at their clothes or their circumstances. True character is revealed not in times of comfort, but in how we treat others when we have the power to judge them, to help them, or to turn them away. Every person you meet carries a story you know nothing about, battles you cannot see, worth that has nothing to do with wealth or status. The homeless man might be someone's father. The person in worn clothes might have spent their last 3 days serving others. The individual you dismiss might be the very person who could teach you the most important lesson of your life. How you treat people in moments when you think it does not matter reveals everything about who you truly are.